You have almost certainly seen the map that says the internet is fragile. A dark ocean, a few thin lines threaded across the seabed, and a warning. This is what everything depends on, and it would not take much to cut it. It is one of the most retold stories on the internet, that the internet itself is a handful of wires away from going dark. That story is wrong, not exaggerated, wrong in a way the evidence has already settled. And the map that replaces it is more interesting, because it explains what the fragility story cannot. Why some breaks are fixed in days and others stay broken for months in the very same ocean. Start with what actually happened the last time a lot of cables were cut at once. In late February 2024, 3 major submarine cables in the Red Sea were severed within days of each other: CCOM, EIG, and AAE-1, 3 of the main lines carrying data between Europe and Asia. On the fragility map, that is the nightmare scenario: multiple simultaneous cuts on a corridor that carries the overwhelming majority of traffic between 2 continents. And the internet stayed up. One of the affected carriers, HGC, estimated the cuts touched about a quarter of the traffic it moves on that route, around 25%, and that traffic simply rerouted eastward through mainland China and westward by way of the United States. Latency rose, some connections slowed, no one was cut off. A corridor carrying more than 90% of Europe-Asia capacity took 3 cuts at once, and the network absorbed it. That is not luck, it is the design. The core of the undersea system is not a few fragile threads. It is a dense, redundant mesh, more than 500 cables in service worldwide, with many parallel paths between any 2 major regions. Cut one line, and the traffic flows around the wound in a fraction of a second, onto whatever other cables have spare capacity. The system was built by competing operators, laying overlapping routes for their own commercial reasons. And the accidental result is a web with no single thread. The whole thing hangs on. That is why the nightmare scenario keeps not happening. The map that looks fragile, thin lines on an empty ocean, is actually thick with alternatives you cannot see at that scale. This is the honest starting point, and it is the part most explainers leave out because it kills the scary version. At the core, the internet is robust. If your mental model is that a few cuts break the world, the evidence does not support you. I want to concede that fully before going any further, because the real argument depends on it. So if being cut is not the constraint, what is? Here is the thesis, and it is the opposite of the fragility story. Being cut is not the binding constraint. Being unrepairable is. A cable break is not a permanent fact. It is a work order. Somewhere a ship has to sail to the fault, lift the cable off the seabed, splice it, and lay it back down. What actually governs how long a break stays broken is not how the cable was cut. It is whether a repair ship is allowed to enter that water and whether one is free to come. Robust core, brittle edge. And the edge is not made of physics, it is made of permission. To see why, you have to look at the water differently. On the fragility map, the ocean is colored by depth, where the cables are, how deep they sit. That is the wrong map. The map that governs a repair is colored by jurisdiction. Who has the legal authority to say yes or no to a ship working in that stretch of sea? The law here is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and its geometry is precise. On the open ocean and across most of a country's exclusive economic zone, every state is free to lay and maintain cables, and the coastal state may not impede that maintenance. Out there, a repair is close to a right, but inside a country's territorial sea, the belt of water along its coast, that country keeps full sovereignty, and a repair ship needs its authorization to work. A cable that comes ashore, that lands, falls under the coastal state's own regime. In practice, the major cable powers, the United States and China among them, require permits and licenses before a cable ship may operate in their waters at all. So the thing a broken cable waits on is not the ship, it is the permit. And notice what kind of line that is. The territorial sea boundary is not a safety line or an engineering line, it is a sovereignty line. Crossing it to work on a cable is not a technical act. It is a foreign vessel operating inside another state's waters, and states treat it accordingly. The break blinks on the seabed, while a repair vessel sits at that line, waiting for a stamp from an authority with every legal right to take its time. And how long that stamp takes is not fixed. According to trade reporting in the cable industry, obtaining a repair permit in certain jurisdictions has stretched from around 10 days to as much as 4 months, with China the case most often cited. That figure comes from industry insiders reported in the specialist press, not from an audited public statistic, so hold it as a characterization, not a hard number. But the direction is corroborated across sources. In permit-heavy waters, the paperwork now takes longer than the repair. Now watch what happens when you put that mechanism to a clean test. The Red Sea gave us one, and it is the sharpest proof of this whole argument, because it holds every other variable still. To know whether the constraint is the physics of the break or the politics of the permit, you look for a case where the physics are identical and only the permit differs. That is almost impossible to find in the wild. Different breaks sit in different waters, at different depths, in different weather. But in the Red Sea in 2024, 3 cables were cut at essentially the same time, in the same water, by the same event. If the physics of the break governed the repair, all 3 should have come back on roughly the same schedule. They did not. After those 3 cables were cut, the breaks all sat in roughly the same body of water, off the coast of Yemen. Same sea, same kind of damage, and the outcomes diverged completely. 2 of the cables, CCOM and EIG, were cleared for repair, permits approved around May of 2024. The third, AAE1, was not. It was refused. The reason had nothing to do with the water and nothing to do with the break. It was a question of consent, and of who was entitled to give it. Yemen's telecom authority is split between 2 rival administrations, an Aden branch under the internationally recognized government and a Sana'a branch under Houthi control. AAE1's consortium was tied to the divided operator, and the recognized government would not grant the permit across that split. 2 cables in the same water got a green stamp. 1 got a red one. The physics were identical. The only variable that moved was who had the authority to say yes. That is the whole thesis in a single image. The repair map is not a map of where the wires are or how deep they run. It is a map of who must consent. And where that consent has no clear address, the break simply waits. And it is worth being careful about what actually cut those cables, because this is where the fragility story usually reaches for a villain. The leading assessment is that the Red Sea cuts were an accident. A bulk carrier, the Ruby Mar, had been struck and abandoned weeks earlier. It drifted for days with its anchor down, dragging across a cable-dense stretch of seabed before it sank. The dragging anchor is the likely cause. The assessment of cable operators and network analysis firms, not a formally adjudicated finding, so hold it as the leading theory rather than a proven one. But it points at the ordinary truth of this whole domain. The great majority of cable faults are accidents. Anchors and fishing gear, not sabotage. There is usually no one to blame, which is exactly why the constraint is the repair, not the attack. Behind the permit, there is a second scarcity, and it is physical. Suppose the consent is instant, every stamp granted the moment it is asked for. The repair still has to wait for a ship, and the ships are few. The global fleet of cable-laying and repair vessels numbers only around 60 worldwide, and only a fraction are dedicated to repair. Roughly a quarter of the fleet is over 40 years old. Against that handful of ships, the world sees on the order of 200 cable faults every year. A small, aging fleet spread across every ocean, working a queue that never empties. And that fleet is not being replaced fast enough. A report commissioned for the industry's own conference estimated that close to half the fleet will be near the end of its working life by around 2040, and that something on the order of $3 billion, roughly 20 new ships, would be needed just to hold the world's repair capacity where it is. These are specialized vessels, expensive to build and slow to commission, and no one operator has an incentive to carry the spare capacity the whole system relies on. So consent is the first gate, and the ship is the second. And even a yes drops you into a line for a resource that is quietly getting scarcer. Those two scarcities, the permit and the ship, help explain something the data has been showing for a decade. According to figures from the International Cable Protection Committee, presented at industry conferences and reported through the trade press, the average time to repair a subsea cable fault has more than doubled over roughly the last 10 years, reaching around 40 days in 2023. I want to be precise about that number. It reaches us through secondary reporting of the industry's own data, not from a primary audited report we could open and check line by line. So treat it as a well-corroborated direction, more than doubled, rather than an exact endpoint. And repair time is not one thing. It is fault finding, plus the wait for a vessel, plus weather, plus permitting, stacked on top of each other. Permitting is one contributor, not the whole story. But the trend is clear. Even before you add a jurisdictional dispute, the queue is getting longer. Now add the dispute back in, and take the clearest case of the queue alone. In February 2023, the two submarine cables connecting Matsu, a Taiwanese island group of about 14,000 people, to the main island were severed 6 days apart, reportedly by passing vessels. What happened next is the part that matters here. Matsu waited about 50 days for a full repair. The island fell back to a microwave radio link. At times, sending a text message could take 20 minutes. And the central reason for the wait was not a permit dispute at all. It was that Taiwan has no cable repair ship of its own, and the specialized vessels that could do the job were few and heavily booked. The island sat in the queue. 2 cables down, 14,000 people on a radio link, 50 days, because when the consent was there, the ship was not. I am carrying the Matsu case carefully, and it is worth saying why. Who cut those cables became a contested question, and I am not going to assert an answer, because for this argument, it does not matter. Whatever severed them, the fact that governs the story is the one that is not in dispute. No repair ship was free, and an island of 14,000 people waited 50 days. That is a queue fact, not an attribution, and the queue is the thesis. Stand back, and the two cases, Matsu and AAE1, are the same structural fact wearing two costumes. In one, no single authority could grant the consent, because sovereignty over the operator was divided. In the other, the consent was there, but no ship was. Both are what happens where redundancy runs out, and the edge takes over. And both point to the same wider pattern. The break stays broken longest, exactly where jurisdiction is unsettled, where a stretch of water has no single clear answer to the question, who is allowed to say yes. That pattern has a geography, and it is worth naming plainly and neutrally. There are stretches of the world's seas where sovereignty is contested or divided, and it is precisely in those waters that a cable break has no clear address for its repair. The Taiwan Strait, where more than one authority claims jurisdiction over the same water. Parts of the South China Sea, where several states advance overlapping maritime claims. The Eastern Mediterranean, where competing zone boundaries cross the exact stretches the cables run through. In each case, the structural problem is identical. A repair needs one authority's yes, and there is more than one candidate for whose yes it is. This is not a claim about who is right in any of those disputes. It is a structural observation that holds regardless of how any of them is resolved. Where two parties both claim the authority to grant or deny a repair, a broken cable can wait on a consent that no one can cleanly give. The consent map, not the depth map, is what decides how long the water stays dark, which is the honest place to be careful again, because the robust core has not gone anywhere. The mesh still reroutes. Most single cuts on the open ocean in well-governed water are invisible to the people using the internet over them, fixed quietly or simply routed around while a ship is dispatched. The fragility story is wrong at the core, and it stays wrong. But robustness is a property of the core, not of the edge. The mesh protects you only where the mesh is thick. A single route island has no second path to fail over to. A divided operator has no single authority to grant the fix. A contested strait has no clear owner of the yes. In all three, the redundancy that makes the core robust has simply run out, and what governs the outcome is no longer the network, It is the permit and the queue. The leverage does not live where the cables are thickest. It lives at the thin edge, exactly where the fragility story never looks, because the fragility story is busy being frightened of the wrong thing. So here is the forward read, and it is a quiet one. If you want to know where the undersea internet is actually exposed, do not count the cuts. Cuts are ordinary, 200 a year, mostly anchors, mostly invisible. Watch the permit map instead. Watch where a repair needs a consent that has no single owner, and where the ship that would do the work is a scarce, aging thing already booked somewhere else. The cable map was never really a map of where the wires are. It is a map of where a break stays broken, and that map is drawn by jurisdiction and by the length of a queue, not by the depth of the sea.